Poland is very quickly becoming a military powerhouse, and this is absolutely fascinating to watch. On August 1st, 2025, Poland would go and sign a $6.7 billion agreement with South Korea for the purchase of 180 K2 Black Panther tanks. The deal would be something that would represent a major step in Warsaw's long term goal of trying to transform the Polish armed forces into what one could arguably say is easily the most powerful land force in the entirety of Europe. For context of what I'm talking about here, the K2 Black Panther is a highly advanced South Korean main battle tank. The first 64 units to be delivered are going to be the K2PL configuration, a customized variant that meets Polish operational requirements, which includes enhanced armor, Polish-made battle management systems, NATO standard communications, and more. These features will make it one of the most modern tanks that is currently available, rivaling or even surpassing many Western counterparts in both mobility as well as firepower. And that really is not something you're seeing from a lot of places. The recent agreement is the second major contract for K2s from Poland, following the initial order of 180 units in 2022 under the previous Law and Justice government, the PIS, which, just as a heads up on this, my friends, obviously you can tell this episode is about Poland. I will be saying a lot of Polish names over the course of this, and you are practically guaranteed to hear a lot of them being pronounced wrong. I say practice. No, you're 100% guaranteed to hear a lot of them wrong coming from me. I'm sorry. I'm preemptively apologizing right now. Either way, under the agreement, Warsaw can procure up to 1,000 K2 tanks. Moreover, besides that, 61 of these tanks from the latest order are set to actually be produced within Poland itself, which is pretty important considering how, when you're trying to import weapons from another country, if something happens and this gets cut off, it's a pretty bad thing to take place. Serial production is expected to begin between 2026 and 2030 to gradually shift from imports of weapons to fully local assembly of the K2PL variant. The deal also includes 81 support vehicles, an extensive logistics and training package, and maintenance infrastructure. Besides this, perhaps most crucially in everything I am describing, it contains a significant technology transfer provision. This allows Polish firms to take over elements of the tank's production, its maintenance, and eventually even parts of its future modernization, which strengthens the domestic defense industry of Poland, again, reducing reliance on foreign suppliers, something that Poland and many other states are finding a lot of difficulty with now. They do not want this to be the case. From this picture that I am building for you here today, my friends, it is estimated that by 2030, Poland is expected to have over 950 modern battle tanks, MBTs, that are in operation. 360 of these being the K2, K2PL Black Panther tanks from South Korea, 366 US M1A1 and M1A2 SEP-V3 Abrams tanks, 235 German-made Leopard 2 tanks, and in addition to that, besides these varying tanks from different countries, Poland still has around 150 PT-91 Twardie tanks, which are an upgraded version of the Soviet T-72 that was produced by the Polish defense industry over the course of the 1990s, which brings, again, the total projected number of tanks to 1,100, which is an incredibly powerful force. To put this into perspective, the combined tank fleets of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, as well as Italy, amount to 950 operational units, meaning Poland itself will outnumber these four countries. Among these nations, only Germany is actively pursuing a significant increase in armored capabilities. The European Union possesses around 5,000 tanks on paper, but really, when we're describing this, only a fraction of those are actually modernized and/or combat ready. You could have ones that are modern, but they're not ready to be used, and you could have a whole bunch of ones that are ready to be used, but they are decades old at this point. And when I say decades, I mean 30 or 40 years and not ready to be used. Because of this, my friends, Poland's tank fleet is set to be the most modern and numerous in the entirety of Europe and one of the most in the entire Western world. From everything that is being done, Warsaw really does seem to be trying to position itself as the new center of the European strategy for defense, especially when it comes to land warfare. Which personally, looking in on this, I can only look at it with a sense of both shock as well as complete understanding considering what it is that Poland has gone through in the past. Because the question, as always, that we try to answer here on the History of Everything podcast is, how exactly did we get here? And with war still raging on between Ukraine and Russia, what exactly is going to happen next? Well, my friends, in order to explain this, we are going to need to step back in time for some context. further back, in fact, so that we can understand the Polish mindset, which really anything that is being done now with Polish remilitarization and modernization stems not just from the past couple of decades, not even the past century. This is something that stems back from 300 or 400 years of frustration. The events that are taking place here are not a new idea. It's just the most recent manifestation of the Polish psyche, screaming, and I will quote this, never again. Which, in order to explain, we're going to have to dive in now. And on that note here, my friends, I'm going to be talking about Russia a lot over the course of this video, because anytime you're talking about the history of Poland, Russia is going to be involved, and it's not going to be in a good way. Which naturally means that I have to be extremely careful with the sources that I use when presenting these things to you, because anytime you're looking at anything to do with Russia on the internet, it's going to be either very pro-Russian or very anti-Russian, and there's like hardly anything in between. But understanding the biases of that is extremely important in today's day and age, especially with the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. Which is why I'm very proud to be sponsored by Ground News, a longtime sponsor of this channel, and the very resource that I use in order to be able to present information to you all in the first place. I'm serious when I say that I can't understate just how incredibly valuable this thing is. With the fact that I'm able to sort varying different sources by their factuality rating, I'm able to see where their inherent biases are, whether they lean left or right, if they are owned by the government, owned by a private entity, or something else in between. All of these things are shown to me. But just as important as who is talking about an issue, it's also important to know who is not talking about an issue, which is one of the reasons why I love Ground News' blind spot feature. Because with anything that is happening around the world, there is inevitably going to be different political ideologies that focus on one thing or the other that suit their narrative, while others conveniently ignore it, which is something you see quite a lot. You need to understand that different media sources today are trying to do largely two things. One, get you to click on the article in the first place so that they make some money, and two, they want you to click in order to be able to convince you that their specific ideology, side, or perspective is right. But if you do that from one type of source, you are never going to get a complete picture. And that is how precisely people control you. I am not perfect, my friends, but I do actively try, and you can as well. If you go to groundnews.com/historyofeverything, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the same plan that I use to get this information to be able to present to you all. Do your own research, don't let yourself be controlled, and good luck out there, my friends. For those of you that are watching this right now, you need to understand that Poland has a very long and proud history. However, due to a national Polish entity getting swallowed up not once, not twice, not even technically 3, but more like 4 times, this has led to the development of a fiercely independent national identity that strives to preserve Poland as an idea at all costs. Again, this is extremely important to understand. As a concept, Poland has existed since around the 10th century, rising first from a duchy to a kingdom and then gradually expanding its influence around the region. The real power surge for Poland, though, would not take place until the late 1300s, and then the early 1500s, when the Polish crown would officially unite with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to create what was then the second biggest state in Europe, really only lagging behind Russia, which at that point wasn't Russia yet, it was just Muscovy, but we don't need to go into all that detail necessarily. Again, I am not going to go into extensive details on this because actually I did just do a full podcast episode on Poland and the rise and fall of it, as well as what ends up happening after it again to see it rise from the ashes, which definitely you should go check out on Spotify or Apple or on Patreon, where I posted all of this. But needless to say, for centuries, Poland was one of the most powerful states in all of Europe. Fragile, but I did explain that part here on the podcast. Anyway, Poland was not going to last, and it would be destroyed for the first time in the 18th century. The Commonwealth would suffer from decades, if not centuries, of internal power struggles, with the nobility, called the Szlachta, which, again, Polish names, I'm going to screw things up, they wielded significant influence, oftentimes at the detriment of the state. The liberal constitution of 1791, which was actually one of the first modern constitutions in Europe, would attempt to address these issues, but it was way too late by this point to be able to stop the partitions. In 1772, 1792, and 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria would divide Poland among themselves, erasing it from the map through a series of deals. With that, Poland was gone and would not be seen again for well over 100 years. Which is important to mention. I have to go this far back because, again, one needs to understand the fierce independence mindset of the Polish people. Throughout the 19th century, there were numerous uprisings against the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians, such as the November Uprising from 1830 to 1831, the January Uprising from 1863 to 1864. And these uprisings, though ultimately unsuccessful, would keep the idea of Polish independence alive. And the spirit is something that the Poles would rally around for generation after generation. No matter how many rebellions failed, there were always going to be more Poles that would try to free Poland. Fast forward a bit of time, and World War I was going to change everything. In the aftermath, Germany, Austria Hungary, and Russia were all destroyed. And out of the ashes of these states would rise a new, independent Poland. The Treaty of Versailles would recognize Poland as a sovereign state, and Józef Piłsudski would become the chief of state. Now, here is where things start to get a little bit messy once again, though. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 would define Poland's western border and granted access to the Baltic Sea by creating a Polish corridor along the Vistula River. Danzig, now then Gdansk, would have a German majority and become a free city supervised by the League of Nations. The League of Nations would propose an eastern ethnic frontier known as the Curzon Line, but Poland didn't really want this. Instead, they attempted to secure their 1772 boundaries with Russia, which led to war with the Soviet Union in 1920, result of which was kind of mixed, but it still was a Polish victory. The Treaty of Riga would actually split the borderlands instead of Poland getting everything, which denied Poland any further possibility of regaining the strategic initiative in the future. Now, although they were defeated, the Bolsheviks in Russia were able to then, with time, use their superior numbers as well as resources to gradually outpace Poland rapidly after 1921. And of the peoples of the borderlands, only really the Lithuanians achieved independence. The Ukrainians and the Belarusians were divided between Poland and Soviet Russia. Still, the eastern border was well to the east of the Curzon Line, so it was a victory for the Poles, but it was one that Poland was not going to be able to capitalize on over the next 20 years, until once again, as we all know from World War II, it disappeared from the map again. Yeah, I will say this, Poland's position has historically not exactly been an enviable one. Their position was stuck between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, meaning in order to survive, they had to for years play a diplomacy game with their life on the line. Not an easy position. Steps would be taken to preserve said life, but ultimately, diplomacy as we know it would fail with the invasion by Germany in September of 1939, and a few weeks later, it was invaded by the Soviets on the other side, wiping it from the map yet again. The war was absolutely devastating for Poland, with millions of civilians and soldiers being killed, and including the Holocaust, which resulted in the deaths of approximately 3 million Polish Jews, it would depopulate large parts of the country. However, the Polish spirit was not going to die. The German attack on the Soviet Union in June of 1941 drastically changed Poland's position because now one of its enemies had become a member of the Grand Alliance. International support was going to be tricky. Under British pressure, the Polish government in exile would reestablish relations with the Soviet Union through the Sokolski-Miaski Accord, which accepted the annulment of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Treaty without explicitly getting Soviet renunciation of annexed Polish territory. Once the Soviet Union had something, and when I say this, especially Stalin, if he had his teeth in you, he was not going to let go. And on that note, as the Germans were retreating, the Poles in Warsaw would begin their revolt in August 1st of 1944 by the clandestine Home Army, which acted on orders from Poland's government in exile in London. The aim of this revolt was to try to free the capital from German occupiers and to take control of the country ahead of the advancing Soviet army so that Poland would be able to rule over itself and not just as a communist puppet. For a brief time, Poland was, technically speaking, free again, but Moscow, and specifically from this Stalin, intending to rule post-war Poland, would go and withhold help and kept the Red Army positioned on the other side of the Vistula River as the capital would bleed and burn. The Germans, with their more professional army and superior weaponry, would end up killing over 200,000 Polish fighters and civilians and razed the city in revenge. Only then did the Soviets move in and take control of everything, executing Polish soldiers and political figures as they moved to establish a communist government under their sway. This was arguably the briefest moment of freedom, if you really want to call it that Poland would have, and once again, it was stripped from them immediately. The post-World War II era would see the Polish Workers' Party take control of the government with Soviet backing. The communist regime under Boleslaw Bierut would begin implementing Soviet-style policies, including nationalization of industry and collectivization of agriculture. This period would see widespread purges, arrests, and executions of political opponents and suspected enemies of the state. Besides the social chaos, this plan also led to significant economic hardships as well as shortages. Fast forward a little bit of time then, and in 1956, a wave of protests and strikes, known as the Polish October, would lead to the ousting of Beirut and the return of Ladislaw Gomulka as the leader of Poland's United Workers' Party, or PZPR. Gomulka would introduce reforms aimed at de-Stalinization and liberalization, including the New Course, which aimed to improve living standards and reduce state control over the economy, surely a rarity when talking about things within a communist state. However, these reforms were rather limited, and they didn't address the underlying structural issues that were creating a lot of corruption and, in general, stagnation. As a result, economic difficulties and rising prices over the decade would lead to widespread protests and strikes going into 1970, especially in the shipyards of Gdansk and Szczecin. Szczecin? Look, I'm sorry, Polish names. My editor's going to put it up here. Szczycin. I promise you I'm trying. Anyway, I wasn't the only person that was going to have difficulty saying things, as it's kind of hard to speak when you have bullets going into your mouth. The government would respond with immense force, resulting in the deaths of dozens of protesters. Gomulka was forced to step down, and from there was replaced as first secretary by the more pragmatic head of the party in Silesia, Edward Gierek. Poland was getting restless once again, and something had to happen. The Gierek decade, which is from 1970 to 1980, began with a number of attempts to try and modernize the country's economy. It truly was an ambitious effort. They wanted to really raise living standards and improve support from the people. Exploiting the softening of relations between the East and West, the détente period, he attracted large foreign loans and investments. Initially successful, this would result in some developments, but things turned rather sour quickly as the world oil crisis would drastically increase the expense of things, and mismanagement of the economy produced huge budget deficits, which Gierek would try to cover through increased borrowing, but it didn't work. The policy of consumerism would fail to strengthen the system, and the new price increases in 1976 led to workers' riots in Ursus and Radom, which once again had to be brutally suppressed. Fast forward a little bit of time then, and in August of 1980, strikes in the Gdansk shipyard would lead to the formation of the Solidarity Trade Union, led by a guy called Lech Walesa. The government was then forced to sign the Gdansk Agreement, which granted workers significant concessions and recognized Solidarity as a legal trade union. And you need to understand how crazy this is. This was unprecedented. This was a working class revolution directed against a socialist state, which really was an example to other peoples of the Soviet bloc, and one of the key signs that things were not really looking so good in the Soviet sphere. Polish desires for freedom simply could not be contained, or at least not for long, because, oh boy, were the communists going to try. Facing growing unrest and economic difficulties, General Wojciech Jaruzelski would go and impose martial law in December of 1981. This period would see widespread arrests, including Walesa, and the suppression of the Solidarity movement through martial law. Martial law would effectively break Solidarity by paralyzing the country and imprisoning virtually all of the movement's leadership, Walesa included. It did not, however, destroy the movement entirely. After the lifting of martial law in 1983, the government, despite its best efforts, really couldn't establish any degree of legitimacy. People were not listening to it. Severe economic problems would only worsen the political deadlock, and so in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev would come to power as leader of the Soviet Union, his policies of reform, glasnost and perestroika, would start a process that eventually led to the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the disintegration of the USSR as a whole. The Jaruzelski regime realized that broad reforms were unavoidable. They simply couldn't continue as they were, and a revived solidarity movement had to be a part of it. The roundtable negotiations that would take place under the auspices of the church would result in a, quote, negotiated revolution. Solidarity was restored and would participate in a partly free election in June of 1989 that would bring it a sweeping victory. This was it, my friends. Poland had done it. It was finally free once again. And as a whole, it swore to never let anything like what had happened here in this video that we have been describing so far take place ever again. This is why I explained everything that I have. The remilitarization of today is tied back to this era. However, in order to make said dream of permanent independence be possible, Poland was going to have to fix itself. Centuries of occupation and exploitation are not exactly conducive to a strong economy. And as such, Poland would implement shock therapy economic reforms under the leadership of Finance Minister Leszek Balcerowicz. These reforms included price liberalization, privatization, fiscal austerity, which, yeah, in the beginning, initially did lead to quite a bit of economic hardship, but it laid the foundation for long-term growth as Poland's economy was going to be able to finally fix itself. And as for diplomacy, then, that is where things once again get a little bit interesting because it's kind of like in the interwar years. Over the course of this time, Poland would have to balance its diplomatic relations between East and West, while at the same time focusing on strengthening its own position. It would seek an alliance with NATO, it would go and try and join the EU, and all of this would work phenomenally well because these efforts were complemented by the external issues that were being faced by other former Soviet countries. As the Soviet Union was absolutely collapsing, this is not something that would be reversed, and Poland wanted to make sure that that was going to be the case. In 1991, the USSR would dissolve into 15 sovereign republics, splitting apart the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe as well as the Soviet Union itself. Ukraine and Belarus, neither of which had ever been established as sovereign states, would both appear on Poland's eastern border overnight, which would act as a buffer between it and Russia, something it had never really had before. As a result, it became official policy of Poland to be friendly to, or if possible, allies with these countries. Though Belarus is its own thing entirely that we're going to have to address at some point because of how incredibly backwards this is and how bad its dictatorship is. Either way, Poland's history with its neighbors, if you really look at the past, considering everything I was talking about, and I know I skipped over quite a bit, that has oftentimes in the past been more conflict than reconciliation. But in the 1990s, the Polish government would prioritize regional reconciliation over pursuing territorial revisions like they had 100 years prior, leading to it joining NATO in 1999 and the European Union in 2004. By the mid-2000s, Poland's strategic, economic, and cultural goal of a Euro-Atlantic integration strategy and defensive organization, that was essentially complete. From here, the Polish economy would grow rapidly over the course of the 2000s. The country would benefit drastically from EU funds, foreign investment, growing domestic market. In fact, this was so strong that Poland was one of the few EU countries to avoid recession during the 2008 financial crisis. It was hurt, but it did not experience recession. In fact, I think off the top of my head, it actually was the only country in Europe that did not experience a recession, which is a pretty big deal. But that is where things get a little bit complicated geopolitically. See, Poland, for all that we've talked about it so far, has had not so much of a major impact on the international affairs of things around it from 1989 to 2004. This is both because it was recovering from the economic damage of the communist period, which was certainly rough, and because it was preoccupied with Euro-Atlantic integration. It didn't really want to focus on the countries to its east. It didn't really matter. It didn't have to do as much with Ukraine or Belarus or others. However, in 2004, that changed quite a bit. This being after Ukraine was rocked by a wave of protests in reaction to a rigged election that would have seen the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych becoming president over the pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko, which there's a lot of victors when talking about things in Eastern Europe, I know. The protests would culminate in the rerunning of the election, and eventually Yushchenko would be declared the winner. Now, of course, while Russia did dislike what was happening, the entire Polish political spectrum was united in its support for what became known as the Orange Revolution. It was perhaps the first major instance of Poland shaping Western policy towards Ukraine. The Polish government would help to mediate roundtable talks between the government and the opposition that helped bring Yushchenko to power. marking this new role as a mediator between the EU and Ukraine. The EU as a whole was rather hesitant to interfere in anything that had to do with the Soviet Union. It really didn't want to step on Russia's toes here this time and potentially kick off a major war. Because, again, this is a time of reconciliation. Poland didn't really have this issue. It's never really had an issue with potentially pissing off Russia. It is happy to do so. In 2008, the Polish government would initiate the EU's Eastern Partnership, a form of cooperation between the EU and post-Soviet countries. The aim was to help prepare countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia for eventual EU membership, something that Poland thought the EU was dragging its feet on altogether or just uninterested in. But for Poland, this wasn't just a matter of, oh, hey, we're helping our neighbors. This is a matter of survival and national security. When Russia invaded Georgia that same year, Polish President Lech Kaczyński would make a trip to Tbilisi alongside leaders of Ukraine and the Baltic states while the war was still ongoing. And in the main square, he would give a speech now famous in Poland in which he warned, and I quote, "Today, Georgia, tomorrow, Ukraine, the day after tomorrow, Baltic states, and later perhaps, the time will come for my country, Poland," end quote. Which, oh dear God, the amount of prophecy that this guy probably had. It's kind of wild because that is precisely what has happened. But this really does illustrate how Poland has a deep historical memory, and this is something that has framed the threat of Russian imperialism as something that must eventually threaten Poland's vital interests. Even if its territory is not immediately being threatened, it will at some point. That is the Polish mindset. Eventually, Russia is going to come for them again. So, fast forward a little bit of time, and in 2014, when Russia seized Crimea, the Poles saw exactly what was predicted 10 years earlier and immediately began to get to work. While the security situation in the EU's eastern neighborhood would deteriorate over the next decade, Poland's economic success would enable it to significantly increase its defense spending, and it would do so immediately in preparation for what it saw as the inevitable coming of Russia. Poland would consistently approach or even exceed NATO's 2% GDP defense benchmarks, surpassing the target in 2015. Over the past decade, Poland's defense budget has tripled, rising from 7.7 billion euro to 23.4 billion euro in 2024. Its defense spending would then reach 4.12%, which made it the heaviest spender on defense in the entirety of NATO in relation to its GDP, and that is truly wild. Yes, a country with a smaller GDP can spend a much larger percentage of it and it not really mean much. But considering how much economic growth Poland has been experiencing over the past decades, it's still a lot. And at the core of Poland's defense strategy is an ambitious military modernization program. Since that point in 2014, after the invasion of Crimea, Poland has more than doubled its armed forces, from 99,000 to 216,000 in 2024, surpassing even Germany's projected military size of 185,000 in 2024. This expansion includes the establishment of the Territorial Defense Forces, a reserve force designed to bolster homeland defense. The 2022 Homeland Defense Act would then aim to further expand Poland's military to 300,000 personnel by 2035, making it the EU's largest land force. We talked about tanks in the beginning. This is in just raw number of people, as well as modernized forces. Poland is trying to be number one in just about everything. Because of this, it has made substantial investments in military hardware. This effort includes acquiring Leopard 2 tanks, F-16 jets, the Patriot missile system. Besides this, you have Abrams main battle tanks from the US, K-2 tanks, and the F-A-50 fighter jets from South Korea. And significantly, Poland was the second country in the world after the US to acquire the Patriot Advanced Capability 3 or PAC-3 missile defense system. This system marks a major upgrade from the earlier Patriot versions, with improved range and precision, as well as the ability to intercept ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and aircraft with hit-to-kill technology. The PAC-3's advanced radar and tracking capabilities also allow it to engage multiple targets simultaneously, providing Poland with state-of-the-art air defense, which, I'll be honest, after everything that happens in Ukraine, I don't know if that will actually end up being useful because Russia's air force might be just gone by that point. Either way, these purchases just aid Poland's domestic production of their own armored personnel carriers and artillery, including the very versatile Rosomak, Crab self-propelled howitzers, and the new Borsuk infantry fighting vehicle, which is designed to replace the much older Soviet-era BMPs and more, which Russia is still trying to utilize. And we've seen a lot of those. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, Poland has been steadily accelerating its rearmament strategy. In 2025, the budget is expected to rise to 4.7%. Moreover, Defense Minister Ladisław Kosiniak-Kamysz has committed to reaching 5% of GDP being spent on defense by 2026, a level unmatched among any other of the alliance members. In 2024 alone, the Ministry of National Defense would sign over 130 contracts with a combined value of 35.2 billion euro. And this surge reflects a clear sense of urgency since Warsaw views the Ukraine war as an existential threat, a sign of what is to come. While Western European nations are still debating long-term strategy, Poland is acting right now. Its geographic proximity to Russia and Belarus, as well as its history, is something that is only going to further shape its national security strategy. Because that's just it, my friends. I've tried to explain it over the course of this video. The perception of Russia as a security threat is anchored in the collective memory of the Polish people. It is a memory of invasion, occupation, betrayal, not just for a couple years or even decades, but centuries through its history. The trauma of the Second World War, the subsequent Soviet domination, that is still something that informs public sentiment today. Consequently, defense is a major strategic imperative for Poland. According to the Security Radar 2025 survey, 75% of Polish citizens support increased military spending. They are perfectly willing to do this, and that figure is easily among the highest in Europe and demonstrates a very rare level of societal consensus. Polish people want to defend Poland. That is something that, even if you look at street interviews in places like France and the UK, you see people being asked all the time if they would be willing to defend their country, and many of them now appear to be saying no. But this collective defense consensus is something that has enabled Warsaw to push forward with easily the most ambitious military modernization program in Europe in decades, without facing any significant domestic opposition. And so, now, my friends, here we are. Once again, Poland is facing a change. A presidential election would take place in June of 2025, and the more nationalist historian, Karol Nawrocki, has been sworn in as the Polish president, using his inaugural address to criticize the EU as he vowed to represent sovereign Poland. As part of his combative speech that he gave in Parliament, which seemed to be aimed at the Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, as well as his allies, Nawrocki would say that the voters in June's presidential election had, quote, sent a strong message that things cannot continue to be governed this way, end quote. He would go on to attack his rivals for the, quote, propaganda, lies, and contempt, end quote, to which he said that he had been subjected to over the course of his campaign. In regards to policy, he said that he opposed illegal migration and joining the euro, and that he wanted a sovereign Poland that is in the European Union, but is and will remain Poland, end quote. At the end of his speech, as a devout Catholic, he would go on to say, "May God bless Poland, long live Poland." And that, I gotta say, my friends, at the end here, this is important to understand where the Polish mindset is today. Backed by the populist right-wing opposition Law and Justice Party, which ruled Poland between 2015 and 2023, Nawrocki would run under the Trump-esque slogan of Poland first, Poles first. After an unexpected visit to Washington in the final weeks of the campaign, Nawrocki would seek and then actually secure Donald Trump's endorsement before he was voted into office. A White House delegation would even take part in the swearing-in ceremony, which just shows how close the two countries have become. And so, here we are, my friends. As it tries to stand up to an increasingly aggressive Russia, Poland has bound itself further to NATO and put itself forth as a leader within the region. It has grown ever closer to the United States in this time through consistent meeting of targets and even exceeding them, along with diversifying relations and suppliers to maintain national independence. It is something that is truly impressive, but that is not to say that Poland is perfect. Over the course of this video, I have talked up a lot of the remilitarization and just how impressive it is what Poland has done. But you need to understand, 5% GDP on defense is hard to maintain. especially when one is at peace and there are other underlying issues within the country. Still, the Polish will keep it up so long as their sovereignty is questioned or possibly being threatened. The phrase never again holds true within the Polish mind, and likely it will continue to be for many more years to come. With that, my friends, we're going to end things here today. As for what the future brings, one can really only guess, but Poland will be prepared, and they will never let anything happen again. Goodbye, my friends. I will see you all here next time. Thank you for watching.